All right, welcome everyone. This is the Jordan B Peterson study group. This week we we've been kind of disorganized so far, and having a multitude of topics kind of roughly gone into this week, and so today will be kind of more of a general conversation that we usually do. Just we have a specific topic that was kind of brought up during one of the conversations during the weekend, and maybe we'll be able to flesh it out a little bit. You can join in on these conversations that we usually have during the weekends, and at the jordanbpeterson.community. That has all the links to forums where we'll be discussing different books and ideas. And I think probably for next week, we'll be going over the Jordan B. Peterson, Matt Dillahunty debate. So if you would like to join in on our conversations about that, then feel free to join. Yeah. All right, so I guess the topics that we kind of mainly went into in regards to Jordan B. Peterson was self-improvement and happiness. But I think probably since we were already discussing a little bit before the broadcast started, we can go more into happiness. And I guess happiness in the hedonistic sense, maybe. Okay, I'll just lay this out here. It seems to me that in order to achieve that happiness, there's a sense of deprivation that has to occur alongside it. And I mean that it's obvious for like certain things, like the sense of pleasure is in no small part due to the deprivation of pain. Unless maybe you're masochist or
Well, that's an important point.
yeah, that's true.
An interesting one.
And I mean, okay. I guess I'm not really wanting to get into that. I think more the overall feeling of happiness, not necessarily just pleasure, but I guess a feeling of contentment. There's a at least from more of an outsider's and a general impression, it seems like in order to achieve that happiness, there is a bit of ignorance and delusion that allows you to get to that. And I'm like on the fence as to whether or not I want to go about achieving that delusion just so I can get happiness, but also like, yeah, I mean, it seems to be our goal to get happiness. Whereas as with Peterson, he brings up a lot about meaning, that people are striving to get meaning, or it seems like once you achieve a certain level in your life where you're not getting meaning, that's when you're actively searching out meaning. Whereas like more agricultural societies, prior
I think
to
that's a good point, John.
Mm-hmm.
It's related to meaning, whether or not you are going to determine if the action is properly good or not, right? So if we're talking about hedonism, let's make sure that we also discuss the various hierarchical levels of meaning that can exist, right? So from a purely hedonistic viewpoint and a purely, say, almost solipsistic perspective, you're the only one that really matters. The feelings that you have are the only ones that really matter. And therefore, achieving good feelings seems fairly straightforward, right? I mean, that seems like an interesting but straightforward set of values. I feel good, therefore I should do what makes me feel good. The problem, I think, in hedonism will come when you start to analyze the value of such a thing across time and beyond the minor little viewpoint that you have as a hedonistic individual, right? So if you want to establish a family, and or be a productive member of society or contribute in some other way, it will be necessary for you to start to include other calculus, right? So also I think neurophysiologically speaking, and the neurotransmitters associated with each of these feelings that we're talking about will probably give us some insight too. The feeling of satiety, the feeling of being satisfied, of being calm and happy and pleased, is an opiate sense. We have a system of neurotransmitters specifically devoted for that feeling, right? To let us know that we've done a good job and that we should stop. There's also dopamine, right? And testosterone, and the interplay between those two things in men in particular, you end up with plenty of circumstances where a man can derive a great deal of personal pleasure from doing something, say, like defeating a beast or defeating an enemy in combat. But let's say you're in gladiatorial combat, and if you defeat your enemy in single combat, you will feel victorious. You will thump the chest, right? You'll stand before the crowd and raise your fists in victory. But if you also understand at the same time that if you defeat your opponent, the rest of the crowd and or his friends are going to kill you, what will that do to your calculus? Right? If you add a outcome or a consequence above and beyond the initial, let's say, biologically driven feeling of victory, then you'll perhaps come up with a different concept of what the good is or the best outcome. I think that something similar to that is occurring in sexual encounters as well. What do you think?
Go ahead, Sumit.
Okay, so one comment I had, Tyler, was that this terminology we are using, I'm glad you are using a different terminology because when we talk about happiness, right, there is this pleasure thing and then contentment. There are two different things because I get a lot of pleasure out of, let's just say, watching porn
Right.
or masturbating.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels so good and it's so kind of, like takes over you. But afterwards, I feel very sad and I feel this is just me. Maybe other people feel differently,
No,
but
you mean
there
like
could be
shame?
other activities. Yeah, not
Shame.
shame. It's just I'm not sure what it is, but it's something like not a good feeling.
Yeah, like
Okay.
guilt also.
Okay, is that because something like? Is it something like if it were a woman, it would feel more complete and right? Right? That if you were with a woman and gratifying your sexual pleasure, that would be the right thing to be doing, but the masturbation and the porn is the wrong thing?
I don't know what it is because I never had a woman, so I wouldn't be able to
Oh,
guess.
yeah. I just mean in your mind, like, is that how it's set up? I'm trying to understand because that seems how it is in many cases. It's
okay, so you may have a point there. It might be a different experience with a woman, like more complete and everything. Yes, but like if we get into this topic of analyzing this one case, I feel like we will like move away from the main point, which was just that I was only bringing up this example because it makes sense to me. But for other people, there'll be other examples where they do something like eat. It's very pleasure, but later on when they're too full they feel like, oh no, I'm going to get fat, I'm going to have trouble with the digestive system, right? So people are doing that all the time. So like in future you get negative inputs, but in the present you are enjoying the activity, as opposed to there are other kind of activities which for example, I went for a bicycle ride today, and this is just my example, other people would have a different example. So it was scorching heat, like it will just vaporize you, and it was not a pleasant experience. When I was coming back, I was just happy to have survived that heat. So it was for like I think 3-4 hours. And now after that I was tired, I had to sleep, I did not like the whole experience, but I experienced more contentment after having done that. So there are two types of pattern I see, that you enjoy right now, later on you regret, as opposed to you do something difficult like climbing the Mount Everest, or going to the gym. It feels hard, but later on you feel contentment. So uh, does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. That's
Sorry, just for a second. I'm just letting you guys know I'm not going to be here just for the next like 5 or so minutes. So if you're like going to ask me a question, I'll just be AFK. So
got it.
sorry.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because in my understanding of the way that, my understanding of the way that the brain works, let's say, is kind of like a difficult task, like this bike ride, is hard to do, and the only way to accomplish it is continuously pump energy into the system. So you have a particular set of neurons firing that are saying, pedal the bike, right? And here's my destination. You kind of have it plotted out in the map in your mind, and you know you have to get there, and you know that it's difficult, and you know that it's requiring more and more energy, and yet you're still pushing more and more energy into the system, right? And as you flood the neurotransmitters through whatever circuitry you're using, and there is a particular pattern, right? There's a cycle that's occurring with every rotation of the pedals and every contraction of every muscle, and you're not aware of it, but it's this hugely complicated, intricate network of activity. And whatever your willpower is, we want to get into that, it's forcing this cycle to continue going, because you could have stopped at any point, right? You could have stopped at the side of the road somewhere and had a break. But the more force you put into it, the more energy you put into it, upon reaching that goal that you've set, once it relaxes, it floods that, let's say, section of, maybe not all of it, but parts of the sections of the neurotransmitters, or the neural circuitry with neurotransmitters related to opiates, right? And this is the feeling of contentment, the feeling of having achieved something that's not related to happiness. And it tells you, okay, you have accomplished your goal, now rest. You've gotten what you wanted, now rest, so you can do it again, right? And it's directly related, I think, to the amount of energy that you have to push into the system to kind of overcharge it temporarily to achieve whatever goal you have. That's the growth, right? It's the forcing. It's the peculiar nature of what it is to be a conscious being in general. Just thinking in pure terms of energy, it's the continual input of energy into a system to achieve an output from an external source, and that external source seems to be something like whatever conscious direction of behavior is. But yeah, that's how I perceive it. That these feelings are associated with particular floods of particular neurotransmitters, and we can talk about that now because we have a greater understanding of these things. But we've always experienced these feelings. It's part of the problem in America right now. We have this opiate epidemic. They're prescribing opiates like candy for anything and everything, or they were. It's starting to change around, and there's an extraordinarily large amount of heroin and heroin-like substances on the street. And all of these drugs are essentially saying to all the people using them that they're constantly finished with a race, right? Like they're at the end of a race, and they haven't really run a race. They're just at the end of a race and, feel great and shouldn't have to go any further. And I think about, let's go back to, say, the sexual gratification. You get this same feeling having a sexual conquest of some kind, let's say, right? That the hedonistic lifestyle produces the intense drive to accomplish the task, which is have sex. Then it produces the intense dopamine and opiate combination cocktail of orgasm and accomplishment, right? And once that's occurred, you feel like you've achieved something, like you've done something good, right? Well, in many cases, the successful reproduction is a good thing. But in this case, it's not being utilized that way. And partly what I think this is doing is, if you are overly hedonistic or overly in pursuit of this particular goal, it's very similar to taking opiates, or taking too many opiates, or however you want to conceptualize it. You are reducing the total drive in the system to accomplish more, right? So let's say the more sex you have, the more feelings of satiety you have, the more feelings of having accomplished your goal you have, and therefore the less drive you will have to accomplish other things, neurotransmitters, so to speak, right? Because you only have a finite amount of neurotransmitters. And as those get used, you have to replenish them through diet and sleep and such. So that's one issue that I would raise with the hedonistic perspective.
Hey, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Like for people who are not that sophisticated about neurology and this stuff, because I think you are onto something there, because one thing I have noticed, just like anecdotally, which is that I have noticed that when people are not in a relationship, right, or they are single, or they are like not having sex, there seem to be some kind of discontent, or
Yeah.
and
It's almost like an anxiety.
Yeah.
It's almost like anxiety, right? And I think it probably has some connection with the hippocampus and how you perceive the unknown, right? So let's say, all right, so this is really interesting about men too, and particularly pre-sex and post-sex, because this is how we end up defining masculinity now. Like the rite of passage for most men seems to be after your first sexual encounter, you are now a man, right? That seems to be how it's set up.
Right.
And there are very few things in life that are like that, right? There are very few things in life that are like such a clearly delineated border between the thing that you haven't done, and then after it, you've done it, and now you're this new thing. You're now a butterfly instead of a caterpillar, right? That's how it seems like in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some truth to it, but it's also a total lie, right? It's also a total lie. You're no different. And after your first sexual encounter, that's kind of what you come to the conclusion of. You're like, oh, I'm not actually any different now. I'm the same exact person that I was. And now it's much more complicated, right? Now it's much more complicated because I've bound myself with the will and intent and mess of another person's life, let's say, in the most intimate manner in which you can. As far as neurotransmitters go, I think this is it's that anxiety, right? It's the unknown. It's the attempt beforehand to determine what the outcome will be by guessing. So you're saying, when am I going to have my first sexual encounter, or when is my next sexual encounter? It doesn't have to be first. When will it happen? I don't know. Well, if you don't know, that's a lot of anxiety. And to reduce anxiety, we have to order the world around us, right? That's one of Peterson's points that he harps on frequently, and it's an extraordinarily important one. In the map of meaning, you're attempting to order chaos in such a way that you can achieve the goals that you're supposed to be achieving, right? So that's that attempt to reduce anxiety and to produce an effect on the world. And if you are continually being sexually gratified, this neural circuitry related to anxiety and the attempt to reduce chaos to order is suppressed. It's diminished, right? You're essentially sitting in the dragon's hoard, just eating your food and looking at all the gold and gems around you and saying, I've done it. I'm here and I'm going to stay here, right? And that's fine. You can stay there. But it seems very much that you can't ever really slay the dragon. The dragon's always in that horde somewhere, right? And if you stay too long, it's going to come back and bite you. And certainly strength has to be maintained. So it seems like there's a direct relationship between how much gratification you're getting in any particular achievement of a goal and how much you're willing to work to get there, right? Yeah, there are, yeah, okay. What do you think about that?
So the more gratification, the less you are willing to work.
Yes, the more you're already gratified, right? Because you've achieved. That's what gratification is. The sense of gratification is you have achieved. So the difference between, let's say, an industrious person or a conscientious person, however you want to define it, someone who produces a lot, let's say, is whether or not they're continuously satisfied with what they currently have, right? So that actually is one way to perhaps think of it. Peterson often says that conscientiousness and industriousness is a bit mysterious. Perhaps it's related to something like that. That the neural circuitry related to the feeling of satiety is not the same, right? They're not sated. They don't get, let's say they don't produce enough of these, they don't have enough of the mu opiate receptors, or they don't produce enough of it. It can break down in a number of different places, but maybe it's a combination of a few of those things. And the physical structure of the brain, who knows, the epigenetic stuff. And I can see how that would work to combine to create a person who is continuously unsatisfied with what they currently have, right? Or maybe the amount of time that they are satisfied is greatly diminished. That's kind of how I think that makes pretty good sense in my head. So yeah, so in a discussion of morals, in a discussion of what it is to do the good and to be the good, and in fact, what we're doing now, I guess, is to find out what the best is, not just the good, but the best. That's an important point to remember, is the rules that we the rules that we decide upon have to include these temporal aspects, right? The amount of time that you are satisfied. And that might be different for each individual, right? So that's why it's so difficult to have these conversations, because you have one person who has, okay, so like Tiger Woods, right? Famous in the media for being a sex addict. I don't know if you're aware of what all went down over here, but he, I guess it's not over here. It's so strange having international celebrities. It's like they belong to the world now, right? Yeah, so Tiger Woods, famed for being a sex addict, and his sexual gratification impulse is larger than, say, like an anhedonistic person who has almost zero drive for sexual activity. And therefore, if those two people were to have conversations, an anhedonist and Tiger Woods, their outcomes, their impulses, their goals, the things that they define as good are going to be kind of dramatically different on the spectrum of hedonism. Right? So the anhedonist, or someone towards that end of the spectrum, will say, look, one sexual encounter a year is fine. That's great. Look, I've been married for 5 years. We have sex every 6 months, right? Like that's perfect. It's great, whatever. And Tiger's like, no, not at all. That's not at all okay. I need to have sex every half hour, on the hour, right? On the half hour. Like, it's got to happen, or I'm not satisfied. So those two perspectives are dramatically different, and contribute a great deal to the complexity of the types of conversations that we're having. It's akin, I guess, in resolving this, it's akin to the notion of the golden mean, Aristotle's attempt to determine the good. It's somewhere in the middle, right? It seems like it has to do with the balance of something.
I was confused about that. Now that it makes more sense, because what I was thinking was, if you are content, then that should you are getting a reward. Then you will be more motivated to this thing, continue whatever led to that reward, right? But
Yeah.
what you are saying is, everyone has a level of base content that they expect, and once they achieve that, they stop working more.
Right. So
Uh,
let's say, okay, yeah, let's conceptual. Let's say you have two tanks, right? You've got a dopamine tank and you've got a opiate tank. And dopiates will associate with the feeling of orgasm, let's say, or of eating a good piece of candy, or victory in a battle. There are a number of circumstances that produce, or getting a notification on Facebook, right? Like, there are a number of things that have been socially engineered, and things that naturally have occurred related to this feeling of goodness, of having achieved something. And then the immediate sensation after that, once that feeling is passed, is the satisfaction, right? But those are the two neurotransmitters, dopamine and opiates, let's say. There's more to it than that, but it's I think that's simple enough metaphorically for us to associate with these things. So a person who is like a Tiger Woods would be someone who produces and or uses an extraordinary amount of dopamine, so they feel really, really good, right? So when they have sex, let's say it depletes that entire dopamine bar, and it just floods their system, and they are booming, right? 100%. It's like snorting 5 lines of Coke for them, right? They just, oh, that was great. Okay. And let's say a Tiger Woods is this huge dopamine tank, but they have this very tiny satiety tank, this very tiny opiate tank. So once he's done, he isn't satisfied for very long, because the opiates get pushed out into the synapses, and he experiences satiety, but not for long, right? He has to recharge that feeling again. Versus the other person, which would have a very small dopamine tank. So they're producing and or have fewer receptors for dopamine in certain regions, right? So when they have sex and or eat a good thing or achieve victory of some kind, it feels good, but not that good, right? Like, yay, meh, right? Those feelings, right? That there are plenty of people that you know that are like that, right? They never get really excited about anything. But if they have a large opiate tank, right, then even that minor feeling can be associated with a great deal of satisfaction. So then they're getting flooded with far more opiates, right? And then feeling that. And so their life experience over time, their natural tendency genetically, is to be more predisposed to paying attention to the stronger feeling, which is the feeling of satisfaction versus the feeling of achievement associated with dopamine. The attempt to, yeah, does that make sense? It makes sense. It makes sense in my head.
Well, okay. So the one thing not making sense for me is, when we spoke about doing something like two activities I differentiated, right? One where you are doing something difficult like climbing a mountain, but after that you feel more contentment, as opposed to something that feels good when you are doing it, and later on you you regret it. So which of the neurotransmitters are operating at which level in which of them, that I'm not able to connect
Okay, so
the neurotransmitter.
dopamine is associated with the intense. You can associate with orgasm. Okay, think of it like that. It's that intense feeling of euphoria. Dopamine is the euphoric experience. Euphoria is probably the most commonly associated word, right? So if you snort a bunch of cocaine, I'm not recommending that to anyone. Don't do it. Right? But if you do, you'll experience a rush of dopamine, a rush of euphoria. It's like a giant orgasm, right? And then immediately afterwards, you will feel satisfied, right? In some way. You will feel calm and relaxed, and you will say, this is the end of your bike ride, right? I made it. Ah, I made it. Yes, I made it. And then you pass out, you recuperate. Those are the two separate feelings of achievement and euphoria and satisfaction, which tells you you don't have to work anymore, right? You're done. Recuperate. So it's a weird interplay between those two neurotransmitters and the amounts that you have and the amount of receptors that you have that probably have a lot to do with these different personality types, right? The ones that are high achievers, meaning they're never quite satisfied, versus the people who are continuously always satisfied to their detriment. You can alter these things by doing something like giving somebody amphetamines, which increase the amount of available dopamine, and you can alter perception of behavior with neurotransmitters. Certain classes of drugs have great effect on it. So,
just one question. When in that bike ride example, this person that I'm talking about, like me, but in the third person, like somebody else, so was not experiencing dopamine.
No, not during it. No. It's when you arrived. Yeah, when you got there. Yeah, during it, I don't know what you're experiencing. I've taken hot bike rides, and you're in a humid area, right? It's a lot of humidity in the air.
Well, now it is so hot that everything is everything just vaporizes. I mean, I'm not sure. Humid would mean there is some humidity in the air, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now it is even past that level. Like there is no humidity now. When the air hits you, it's like warm air. Like it's like the exhaust of like the backside of the sea.
It's no longer right. It no longer provides a cooling effect. Yeah, I know that feeling. That's what I meant. Yeah, I know that feeling. It's terrible, right? It's absolutely terrible. The faster you go normally on a bike, the cooler you would expect to be. But then you're getting hotter and hotter, and it's awful, right? So yeah, there's probably zero dopamine during that time, right? Your body's like, no, this is not good. I do not enjoy this. But having arrived, once you've achieved the goal, so you had a neural map in your mind, you conceptualized it probably using the cerebellum and some other weird proprioception relationship that we have and the way that we determine where we are in the world and how our body is moving through it. But you had this map, and your goal was get home. And you knew that, and your neural circuitry knew that. So it knew that you will not get the dopamine unless you achieve the goal, when the goal was get home. So when you got home, I don't know how big your dopamine hit was, but there was probably something that said, yes, I made it. Oh, I didn't die. I'm okay. It's okay. All right. Okay. And then you get the flood of opiates. Now, we're talking about it in terms of exaggeration. So let's say the sexual encounter, the orgasm, is going to feel far greater than arriving home on a bike ride. But for some people, that's not entirely true. So adrenaline junkies, we call them, right? People who jump off the sides of bridges or mountains, or who participate in things like the Tour de France, for bike riding. These people enjoy this experience more than sex, right? So your typical person's neurotransmitters and circuitry are set up to enjoy sex as the most pleasurable thing, let's say. That's like your default human being, right? Because that's how reproduction occurs. That's how the continuation of life occurs. We don't know why that's associated precisely, I guess, but at a basic level, that's what it seems to be. We would all kind of die off if it didn't feel good to do this weird act, right? Which is really strange when you start thinking about how it all works. Have you ever watched people kissing and like really thought about it? They're trying to eat each other. Isn't that weird? It's so strange. Like, especially like just the most violent kind of French kissing, right? As we call it, French kissing. It's just tongues going at each other and the mouths opening, and they're all just going back and forth. And it's like they're trying to consume each other. It's very strange.
I don't know if it's well. It certainly appears like that. But I mean, if you look at the model for our senses, one of our most sensory places is the mouth, and so it's almost like tickling of all these senses in a way that's like outside of your own control, which is why people enjoy tickling, I suppose.
Who enjoys tickling? I don't.
Well, being tickled. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's this weird
the play circuitry
documentary that goes into that. Sorry.
All right. So yeah, that aside, yeah, maybe we're not trying to eat each other, but that's what it's always seemed like to me. That that there's okay. Well, here's another just a minor example. We don't have to go on it, but when people see a cute baby, have you ever heard someone say, "I just want to eat you up"? Now, I don't know if that's peculiar to American culture, but this is a common phrase, and this notion of something being adorable and that you want to eat it and consume it. There's plenty of examples of cultures that would say consuming something gives it its properties to you, right? Plenty of Native American cultures have that tradition, and I think a number of other cultures probably have something similar to it, that the ingestion of something makes it a part of you. Now, that's true physically, right, in terms of behavior. So
I guess my main reason for bringing up hedonism and happiness was the whole dichotomy between being content within where you are currently and essentially ignoring everything else, and actually experiencing or it's like widening your perspective and the pain that kind of goes along with that. Like just like when you're riding the bike, the whole process is displeasurable. It's stressing your body literally, and it's almost like once you finally get rid of that stress, that's when a higher amount of pleasure occurs than if you had not put the stress on, or if you had just like stayed stress free.
Yeah. Let's say like
pleasure before Tyler goes in.
No,
I wouldn't call it pleasure because it's not pleasure at all. It's kind of a how do I say the right word would be contentment that that I did something good today. Like I was not like going smiling and like that whole thing. Hey, I did it. I just like very kind of calm contentment. Like
see,
I'm
now that makes me think that you're someone who appreciates that neurotransmitter feeling more, right? That maybe you have your neural structures and your neurochemistry and your experiences through life have attuned your perception to enjoying, let's say, the experience of being satisfied more. And
I think it is that satisfaction feeling that you're getting, because it's like, but it's something that you wouldn't have achieved had you not gone through the process.
Right. So let's say, John, you were talking about putting more energy into it and feeling more satisfied. Let's say you're like, okay, so let's bring it back to the good for you, good for your family, good for culture throughout time. Hedonism is like setting up one little racetrack circuit in your brain related to the self achieving pleasure, right? So that if you were a man and you want, let's just stick with sex. If you're a man and you want a lot of sexual pleasure, you have this one little circuit related to the self, whatever it looks like in some weird complicated mess. And as you pleasure the self, that circuitry is involved in the use of these neurotransmitters, dopamine and opiates. And yeah, so if you pleasure that and then release, the dopamine and the opiates, that's great. You feel good, right? But if you broaden it now and you have children, it's more than just one circuit. Now it's the self circuit, and you have like, I have two boys. Yeah, I have two children circuits that are all also constantly running, and I'm evaluating their own contentment and their own goals and desires and such. And so when I structure my world and the way that I achieve my goals and the goals that I set, it's now including far more neural circuitry than just that simple hedonistic circuit, right? So when I achieve a goal that satisfies the hedonistic and the two little boys circuits, the total amount of neurotransmitters being released is greater, right? And on a simplistic, direct relationship, the total amount of neurotransmitters being released is greater. So if I achieve satisfaction for the hedonistic self-serving cycle and the two boys, I'm getting a larger amount of dopamine, right? Or a larger amount of the opioids, or whichever you prefer more, right? So that's, and as you add more and more people to your neural circuitry, you're getting a larger and larger map of meaning, right? A larger and larger map of what it is that you have to achieve in order to get the dopamine or the opioids or just the feelings, right? Because when we say feelings, we're really just also talking about this neural circuitry. So we can stick at the level of feelings or the neural circuitry. I think it works at both. So yeah, that's how I guess I conceptualize the Piaget, his
Piagetian model. Yeah, the
equilibration.
Yeah. So with the inclusion of more people in your map of meaning, like that kind of raises your level of need, it kind of raises your level of necessity or need before you can kind of get that state. So like if you lived as a bachelor in just the purely hedonistic pleasure for your specific self for your entire life, that's something that you can become accustomed to and familiar with and know how it works. But when you include other people into this model and then kind of extend that more so outwards, besides yourself, there's more that there's a greater amount of your incapacity to fulfill your brain model of fulfilling the pleasure for these.
The complexity of the system just becomes infinitely more complex the more people that you add.
And it becomes less likely to, or it's not as simple, and it also requires more effort, and it's something that it puts you into a place where you're not capable of fulfilling.
Yes, exactly, and that's such an interesting point too, because you're no longer, since you're not in control of yourself, you're now including these other people that have their own willpower. You can think of them as like part of the environment, part of reality that isn't you, right? It's like part of God, let's say, right? And so in order to achieve this non-selfish, non-internally localized, let's say, although in some strange way it is still all internally localized through the neural circuitry, or maybe there's more to it, who knows? That you have to appeal to this meta concept, right? You have to appeal to God in your attempt to achieve the goal, all right? And the greater the goal, the more you have to appeal to God. And God is the greatest good, or the configuration of external space and internal space that produces the result that you're attending. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just having a bite.
So, all right. and all right, so here's how I conceptualize suicide in a similar way, right? So suicide is like the meta goal of lots of neural circuitry attempting to die at once, right? So it's like a sudden. So if you go through your life and you're providing for your family, this happens with a lot of men in high stress situations, and suddenly you lose your job, right? Your ability to maintain all of that neural circuitry that you had going suddenly collapses, right? And the neurotransmitters no longer function in the way that they were before because you're no longer satisfying it. So you have a dramatic drop in certain levels of in the way, this incredibly complex way that they interact. So the serotonin seems to be highly related to this, right? So it's almost like you build this structure up in your mind, this complicated form, and it's running on the juice of these neurotransmitters, right? It's running on the juice of serotonin and dopamine and the opioids, and there's some others, but those class of chemicals. It's once you can no longer support that structure, the neurons themselves are no longer being fed by the same level of neurotransmitters, and so they're attempting to or experiencing a type of cell death or a decrease in cellular activity, right? And if enough of that is occurring at once, you get this feeling of wanting to die, right? Which is like just the highly abstracted meta experience of all of those neural structures attempting to die, right? Essentially that they are feeling, each little neuron and neural structure is feeling like it's no longer necessary. It's not getting the juice it did before.
Yeah, it seems related to being that level of responsibility increased so much that you're incapable of knowing how to respond to that. And it's not even just responsibility, but just your level, like your world. In fact, it is just become too much for you to be able to handle, to the point where it would be better if you were not there to kind of get in the way of that, so that like people aren't relying upon you. Well, I don't want to be unfair. I don't know.
It's okay to be unfair. Life is unfair.
Yeah, I feel
really
like John
unfair.
Okay. So I feel like John is talking at cognitive level, and the Tyler is talking at this more hardware level. So Tyler, you said that now all those neurons are kind of not getting used the way they were getting used before, or something like that, and so then you should feel like dying, like some part of you is dying. You should not feel like killing yourself, which is a different thing.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's. I think it depends greatly on what you identify with, right? So, and this is, yeah. So if you identify with this neural circuitry that you've been paying attention to, so what consciousness seems to be is this thing that pays attention to sense data and then has the choice to alter it, whatever it is, and to make alterations to it, right? So whatever it is you're experiencing through life, the amount of visual data that you're getting, the amount of, I mean, maybe you're blind and you have no visual data, right? It could be, but whatever it is you're experiencing a great deal of frequently over and over again, that's what your conscious experience is. And you can alter that. You can pay attention to your breathing or not pay attention to it, right? There's some aspect of focusing down on something and paying attention to it. So identity resulting in suicide is the the person who identifies with the neural circuitry that is dying, right? Someone who experiences the same type of thing and does not commit suicide is able to utilize other still functioning neural circuitry, right? It's something as simple as the value of life is more than the suffering you are currently experiencing, and the suffering will pass. Those are actual thoughts that represent neural circuitry that exists in your brain. And if you continually focus on that, like a mantra, right? If your whole life collapses before you, and I've experienced things like this, right? If you focus on a mantra that is life-affirming and life-giving, it's just you, the conscious thing, paying attention to that, which is functioning still, versus the other thing, which is no longer getting the juice that it was before. And through some mysterious process, if you work hard enough at it, you can kind of recapture those old circuits in new ways. You can reformulate them, right? If you experience the death of a child, that circuitry is now horribly misfigured. And you can no longer produce the outcomes and the ways that you used to, right? So if you want to make your child happy before, you would just pick them up and bounce them on your knee. Now that they're dead, you can't do that. The circuitry just can't function. And so if you identify with that process more than anything else, then your life is over. That is your life. That's your identification. But if you identify with far more, if you identify with all your other children and your wife and your community and yourself throughout time, right? That is a set of neural connections and patterns akin to like the some beautiful cathedral or some magnificent forest setting or something that is just full and brimming of life, despite the fact that, you know, the forest floor is full of death, right? Like this, that's the difference between someone who feels like they need to commit suicide versus someone who's just experiencing the tragedy of the death of a smaller part of their identification. I'm thirsty.
To me, I now get what you're saying, like in a much better manner. But as you're talking, I also kind of am seeing that maybe it is to be looked up as something like your brain malfunctioning. And what I mean by that is it is such a shock to your system. Like, let's just say you identified with the relationship so much that and it fell apart. Then that comes off as such a great shock to your system that maybe in some people it just decides to kill itself. And it is not able to, maybe that just temporary this thing state of, like we say, insanity, temporary insanity. Maybe it's a temporary state of your brain just, you know, going haywire. Maybe it's just that.
Just haywire? It can. Yeah, it certainly can. You're right about that, because you can take certain classes of SSRIs and have a side effect of suicidal ideation. Right? This is a commonly experienced but not well understood phenomenon, but it does exist. So you can have haywire, right? But the way that life seems to be structured is that we develop these circuits that make sense, right? That have meaning with the way that we interact with the world. And so it's not necessarily going haywire, but if you experience actual tragedy, if you experience the actual death of your child or a loved one, it's an actual neural circuit that is being affected. So I wouldn't necessarily call that haywire. It's just that suicide was kind of like sex, right? There's a before and after. The first time, that's it. You can't go back on that one. So there are people who, I don't know why I was smiling when I said that, but there are people who commit suicide, and that's their final act, right? They didn't make it through that period of tragedy. But the people who do make it through that tragedy are the ones who find some other neural circuitry to pay attention to. And it could be as simple a mantra as life is worth living, life is worth living, life is worth living. And if that's been bred into you your whole life, right? If you were raised, let's say, in the protective auspices of the Christian church, so to speak, Dr. Peterson, you're filled with this sense of life being sanctified, of being something worth protecting, and even yourself, right? And that's a kind of neural protective attitude, or in this case, neural circuitry, that's more potent, more powerful, more associated with your identity than the other circuitry that's dying off.
It is so weird because even before you started talking about Christianity, it was hitting on me that that religious thing was kind of getting triggered in my mind, and then you started talking about Christianity. So I had some tough situations, and one thing I always thought about was sanctity of life, and that is a Christian idea. So you are exactly right about that. Like those thing that you're, because my dad gave me New Testament when I was a kid, and I started messing with it. I don't know where I picked up sanctity of life from that, but I think I did, and it kind of was there for me when I needed it. And even before that, what I realized was, Tyler, that I, as someone who isn't I told you earlier, right? I was listening to this New Testament audiobook, but I wouldn't call myself still religious. Like I don't think there is a God, or there is not. Like I don't know. So I don't participate in religious rituals. But as someone of that kind of person, which I believe a lot of person are like me. Uh, so
Yeah.
people who are not religious and more are becoming like it. So for people like me, there is nothing to buffer us against the tragedy, because what do I really believe in? Like believe in a bunch of things, but as compared to someone who is religious, who thinks eventually things will work out, eventually like there is a God, and like we see all these religious stories where things are not working out for a particular character, but they have faith in God that eventually things will work out. So they have this strong thing that things like some kind of good will eventually come.
Right.
But I, as
That's
a non
patience. You're describing patience there.
so I, as a non-religious person, don't have that. And
I would argue against that, though. I don't think
okay.
you have to be religious to have it. So, for instance, the phrase that I use, the protective auspices of the Christian church, is from Peterson's Maps of Meaning, the opening. And it's, you don't have to believe in the building that you're in and the hands that built it in order for you to use it, right? The structure of the building, the pipes leading to it and the water flowing, the roads that were built, all the stuff that you go about doing in life and utilizing, you don't have to believe in them. They're just there. They exist and they function. And I think it's something is very similar to the neural circuitry that gets programmed into us via religion, right? So America is founded on an extraordinarily large number of religious principles, let's say. And though we have attempted to separate the secular from the church, and rightfully so, you cannot separate the mores, the values of the culture, from that which was foundational. I don't think it's possible to do that. So the value of life, the sanctity of life, is something that many people appreciate, and they can look inside their heads and say, well, I don't believe in a God, therefore the sanctity of life that I have, or the sanctity I have for life, is not the result of a belief in God. I think it's a misstatement, right? I think that we teach each other, we structure our society, we build our buildings, our temples, to this notion, and it gets imprinted in us as a part of our civilizing and our upbringing, and it's inextricably tied in with our neural circuitry now. And you can say, I don't believe in a God, or I have noticed that all of these religions are weird or awkward in some way, and that people do crazy things in the name of religion, therefore I'm not going to participate in it. And or just the agnostic thing, like I don't know. But I would say that many of the presuppositions that we have in life have been granted to us from a religious perspective, because prior to the scientific religion, that's essentially all we had. Yeah, I mean, science is a religion, by the way. Religion is just mode of action.
I think we can clarify this a little bit better, because this brings up the Matt Dillahunty Peterson point, where Matt Dillahunty doesn't say that his axiom that life is good, essentially, or something to that equivalent. He doesn't get it from religion, but from he's a descendant of ancestors who had the belief that life is good, that then led to them procreating. And so I guess his justification for believing that life is good is that that belief is successful. It's a pragmatic belief in that instance, I think. But there are still instances where, I mean, if you're a true atheist, then you're going to disregard. Okay, and this is what Peterson means by a true atheist, and disregarding all of the beliefs that have been passed down to you from your ancestors, and throwing away all previous fundamental axioms, and then building up from there. So, how do you know that life is good? Let's take a critical look at that in the antinatalist community. That's kind of a large part of what they're doing, and looking at whether or not that fundamental axiom that Dillahunty has, and kind of poking holes in it, essentially. And it's so. Okay, this brings me to the main topic that I had, or my main question behind all of this is, within, say, the more nihilistic perspectives, there's that rightful proclamation or rightful understanding that the people that are not nihilistic are those that are ignorant of essentially the nature of suffering within life. They are people that are living within their optimism bias that is built into them from evolution and through their upbringing, and through how they're choosing to not face the cold, hard, nihilistic aspects of existence. And so there's that, I see that there are certain perspectives that if I were to take on would put me into that same mindset. And I'm faced with a choice on whether or not I should or would want to take on those perspectives and risk the blissful ignorance that I face currently. And I mean, it seems in certain regards, I feel there's little choice I have in it, because my own intuition or passion is driving me towards a deeper look at what it is that, say, the antinatalist community is saying, and trying to decipher that and fully understand them from their own perspective. But by doing so, I lose that blissful ignorance. And
all right, so let me step in.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not commit murder. This is a command. It's a phrase. It represents neural circuitry in your mind associated with these high-level concepts of what life is, what it is to take life. And if you go about through your life not committing murder, you're living according to this command. Let's call it religious, right? And if other people see you living according to this command, you are rewarded, because in their mind, they're also carrying this command. And it's part of this larger system of rewards and civilization, where if we agree upon the same set of rules, we can construct something, civilization, right? We can build buildings, we can make roads, we can have DMVs and stand in line for hours, right? We can have all these nice things that we just agree on a few particular rules. One of the most important being, thou shalt not commit murder, right? And over time, we've been able to, I think, condense these set of rules into something as simply stated as the Christian view, that you should love the greatest good, you should love God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. Those are specific rule states in your mind that if you follow, you get the feelings associated with them, right? So the dopamine, right, or satiety from the opiates, or however you want to conceptualize it, but the feelings of achievement. Now, if you have no structure, none whatsoever, and you're a feral child, right? You haven't been taught language, you haven't been taught religion of any kind. Your neural circuitry is primarily limited to these basic lower brain, non-primate, non-mammalian, non-human, however you want to conceptualize it, rule states. But there's something above and beyond in the neocortex that we can program in that allows us to develop these insanely complex and abstract rule states, wherein if we accomplish them, we get ever greater and larger and more complicated releases of these neurotransmitters and or feelings associated with them. So that's when it comes to what it is to have a religion or to believe in a religion. It's as simple as that, I think. It's just recognizing that our brains function on rules and that our lives function according to rules. And our feelings of satisfaction and our feelings of achievement are straightforward. They're set up according to these rule states, right, of achieving goals. You set out your map of meaning and you look for the direction you need to go, and then you organize chaos as you approach it, as you encounter it. And so religion, and the best religion, what it means to be the best of something, the eudaimonia, the greatest good, is the religion which encompasses the answer to all questions, right? That can answer all questions. And this is why science is now, I think, in many people's minds, the dominant religion, because it has answered so many questions, right? So many questions. The problem that I see is that it's really hard to evaluate which of those questions really matter. You experience this in a common sense way when you read about somebody who's done some absurd scientific experiment, like, why do cats have sandpaper tongues? That's really, really important for an undergrad somewhere, right? Because that is related to the neural circuitry, dopamine, satiety, all of that they get when they solve it. But in terms of the broader knowledge of mankind, we could probably get along without understanding intensely in such detail why cats have raspy tongues. So the evaluation that needs to occur for the greatest good is handled by religion, right? And it's what tells us that raspy tongues on cats is not as important as providing a good life for your family and yourself and your culture. So that's God. Right? When people say they don't believe in God, what is it that you don't believe in? Is it like a character, an outline of a person, a patriarchal father? That's a real big no-no right now in our Western culture. Down with the patriarchy. What is it that people aren't believing in? Is it the flying spaghetti monster? To all of these absurd notions of what God is, I think they're just poorly conceptualized. Yeah, God isn't a thing, like a thing that you have to you don't have to believe in your car. You just use your car. You be the thing that moves with the car to the location. You enact, right? And that's what religion is. It's our conceptualization of how to be, how to behave, how to act. So the biggest problem I see is that there are people who are deliberately setting up science against religion as though it's some battle that must occur and one side needs to be vanquished. And I don't see them as very different at all. I see them as both part of an attempt to understand the world and ask questions and answer them. But nowhere in science, nowhere in the measurement process, does any of it indicate that we shouldn't believe in a God, that we should detest religion, that we should detest the best possible choices of our ancestors, let's say. Right? There's this huge push at every generation to kind of despise your parents or despise that which came before you. And that's that continual saving of the father of culture, right? That's that continually, you must renew that which was discovered as true by your ancestors at your peril. If you don't renew it, cast it aside, and you lose at the basic level, the neural circuitry associated with all of that structure. I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a while. Sorry.
Yeah, it's the strongest argument that the atheists have that is the thing that brings most people out of religion is the arbitrary nature of suffering to the innocent. Where if there was a God that was all good, he would not create a system where such suffering could occur. And I know along with that, there's kind of the common response that from Christians that by what evaluation method are you coming up with suffering being bad? Because in order to have a system of evaluation, you need to have some idea behind what's more good and what's less good, or what's more bad and what's less bad. And if through the naturalistic worldview, there are differences between things, but there is no evaluation process that can occur unless you first impart this fundamental axiom prior to that. Say life is good. That's what you can put in, and then try to, if life is good, then here are the oughts by which you can generate the most amount of life, or
yes,
or if well-being is good, if that's your, and these are your oughts for how to stop suffering within the world, so that
or reduce unnecessary.
Yeah, so that well-being can flourish or is maximized, essentially.
Yeah, that is the value of religion, or at least should be. Now, it because it has such a powerful effect as the structure in our mind, it's continuously being hijacked by those who wish to use it to oppress others. And this is another common point, right? That religion and its structure is malleable, and purposely so when used by the nefarious purposes of whoever, right? Like Hitler was coming up with his own religion. And there are, countless examples of people who attempt to use this pattern, let's say, for control. But in the same instance, that it's really interesting, because in the United States, we have a big gun debate going on right now, right? The existence for the gun and its capacity to do harm is what's contested by some, right? Like, because it exists, it can do harm. Therefore, let's make it not exist functionally, right? It's an attempt to reduce suffering by making it not possible to suffer that way. I think it comes from the same feeling that, yeah, I would say this desire to reduce suffering and or make it not happen seems very fundamental. It seems
that's the core value structure behind the antinatalist community, because if it's in the same cases that or it's related to the gun control debate, if a gun is only or is primarily a introducer of suffering within existence, then we can remove, say, those guns, and then thus remove the prospect, thus remove any suffering caused by that gun. Now, from the antinatalist perspective, you can replace gun there with life. If suffering is a consequence to life, an inevitable consequence to life, you can remove life and thus remove all unnecessary suffering or necessary suffering. It's all. There's no longer that deprivation of pleasure, or there's no longer that need for pleasure, and there's no longer that inevitable consequence of suffering.
Right.
And so, I think that's where the problems arise with, say, Sam Harris's moral landscape well-being argument, because well-being is, in order for him to make it objective, it's like, okay, humans exist in the world. Every human has the preference to be within well-being, and we can measure well-being. But that, even if you can't measure well-being, that is kind of unrelated. It's essentially a fact that living things desire to live a prosperous life. Now, if how do I? As living.
Sorry, don't let me interrupt. Go
ahead. Okay. If living itself is not, if there is no objective good outside of life, like it's a moral system imparted unto nature. It's not something built into nature, which is like the atheist's argument against God, because God, if God exists, he would be an evil being to produce nature in where unnecessary suffering would occur. So, as long as well-being is something to be maximized when it's within the existence, say, of life, then if you take, I see it, if you remove life from the equation, thus there's no longer that need for well-being to be maximized, and there's no longer any unnecessary suffering, which even with that scientific moral structure, it would be impossible to create the perfect society where everyone is living with absolutely no suffering.
Well, how do you choose without evaluation? It's randomness, right? Choosing without evaluation is randomness. So without, I think that's really what it comes down to. Is the free will.
Should we flip a coin?
Yeah, exactly. The free will versus determinism argument. I feel like it's, so in some sense, the universe exists, and it is arguing with itself about free will versus determinism. Okay? Like, we are collections of matter having these weird discussions over the internet about free will and determinism and religion and all that. The universe is doing that. Right? It's arguing about these concepts. So I think there are some arguments that are more fundamental than others, and I think this is probably the most fundamental. Do things have choice? Right? Does choice actually exist? And if that's the case, what's the outcome? And our brains are highly specialized to do that calculus, to continuously make that effort to determine what will happen if you make a particular choice. We visualize it. We try to reorganize our choices in abstract and concrete ways to determine what the best outcome is. But I think at the fundamental level, that's it. It's the big question about whether or not a thing should be allowed to choose, because suffering is typically seen as something else choosing or making a choice that then caused you to feel bad. And it's either some other agent, some other actor that you imbue with a sense of intent, or it is the randomness of nature. I think those are the two ways that it's seen.
But then,
so it's everything happens for a reason or nothing does.
Sort of, yeah. Yeah. It's, I don't see a middle ground on that. And this is the absurdity of, like, see, we have all these really interesting arguments like the antinatalist position, but there's an absurdity that often is not pointed out that needs to be. And that is that if you, let's just stick with antinatalist. If you posit that there is a God and then attempt to criticize him, what are you really doing? Right? So if you posit that there is a God that you can criticize for designing nature with suffering, let's say, what fool are you to criticize God? And if you think yourself, say, not the fool and capable of criticizing God, then the God that you're criticizing can't be the God that you're conceptualizing as being capable of criticized, right? It can't be the omnipotent Almighty. You're finding a flaw with a God of your own imagining. And it's such a strange position to take. Like, you cannot at the same time posit God exists and also criticize him. You have to do something ridiculous like raise yourself above God in order to do that, right? And that's the violation of the first Christian law, right? It's
okay. So let's
greater than the greatest good.
Let's translate that into the naturalist position. If the nature of the universe is not necessarily random, but so expansive so that any possibility can essentially occur. then the, is a critique of that naturalistic universe, is that invalid? I guess because it imbues you that it's unfair and not worth. It's essentially bad in nature, or not worth living in.
It depends. Yeah, I mean, that depends if you're King David or Bathsheba, or you know, Hiroshima, or the bomb being dropped in the United States, right? Everybody's going to have a different. Like, that's the problem with that calculus, is that it's entirely subjective and incapable of being transmitted to anyone else. That's the problem with it. It cannot function as a golden rule.
Why not?
Well, because not everybody suffers. Not everybody suffers in the same way.
I had sorry, I got a call. I was away for a while, so I don't know what you guys were talking about till now. But I just have got two these things to say. First one was I think John said that no, even before, something more important. What Tyler said, which was something like something about choice and some other person, the external environment, some person or something happening in the external environment, which giving you some kind of pain, right? Some kind of suffering. But then, like I was saying that then the whole Buddhist, not Buddhist, what Buddha taught. I'm not sure if you can call it Buddhism, right? So whatever he taught, he was talking about how I don't know what he was talking about, but I have been reading a book which kind of explains that. So in that, the author is saying that suffering has a cause, and if it doesn't have a cause, then you are screwed. Like, you are suffering and then continue to suffer because it doesn't have a cause. But if it does have a cause, we should find out and eradicate that cause, and then we will be not suffering anymore. And then their solution seems to be not that you go out there and if someone is bothering you, you ask the other person to change. It's to reconfigure yourself psychologically, so that you are no longer suffering because of that. So part of it is about detachment also. I have not finished the whole argument there. So then then you cannot, like, then then Tyler, there is a choice, right? You are choosing to move out of that suffering. So you can't exactly say that the argument about not you can say, I mean, I'm not talking about you just one cannot say that.
Okay, all right, yeah, this is a good distinction too between the modes of being, let's say. So the Buddhist imperative to restructure the self so that you are no longer affected by the tragedy is one strategy. This is akin to reorganizing and reshaping your map of meaning in your neural circuitry, right? So, for instance, if I go in the backyard and somebody puts a piece of heavy wood there and then points a gun at me and tells me to lift it over and over again, I'm going to suffer, right? And it's going to hurt, and I'm going to hate it. And I'm not going to feel any good from it. But if I go in the backyard and I start picking that piece of wood up because I want my muscles to get bigger, and it's the exact same action, it feels good, right? Because now I'm achieving a goal and I'm releasing that particular neurotransmitter, right? So dopamine and opioids and all that. So that's the internal restructuring, right? And I can also, if the guy's pointing the gun at me, or maybe it's a woman, let's be equitable. I can also do the same thing while he's got the gun on me, or she has got the gun on me. I can say, all right, you know what? Screw this person. I'm going to get bigger muscles, and I just have a gun pointed at me. So I can restructure my map of meaning to make it right, to start producing the proper neurotransmitters so that my current self is more functional in this new situation. The other alternative is to kill the guy with the gun, right? Those are your alternatives to satisfy it here. Or you can just suffer. Right? You can suffer. And so like, let's say Western world is externalized, right? It's part of the yin-yang cycle where we're trying to reorder the outside world. We're killing the dude with the gun to make our lives better. We're building hospitals. We're building civilization. We're building whatever. Versus the more Eastern tradition of reorganizing the internal perspective of things to be more harmonious with the outside world that needs no changing. Right? So it's, and in fact, to attempt to make change, this is another big part of it. An attempt to make change becomes inappropriate, right? Being on the way, being in the way is just being, right? It's not, that's a really important, see, I think the two hemispheres essentially are those two things, right? Those two strategies of life. So your left hemisphere, the analytical decider, let's say, attempts to reorganize the world and structure it in a way that it makes more sense. And the right hemisphere is the dreams and the chaos of what things are and could be, right? The internal language and internal world. And the constant communication between those two strategies throughout a period of developmental time associated with the structure and rules of language and our religion produces a sense of self. It's like an accumulated series of choices between those two strategies. And the highest abstract experience of that accumulation of choices is the sense of self. Something like that. Roughly speaking.
Another thing I wanted to talk about, and which is not related to this, but it can help with this thing, even though it doesn't connect directly right now. So remember this book I'm reading called Personality and Psychotherapy by Joseph F. Don't know how to pronounce his last name. It's this book.
Joseph F. Okay, let's see.
I'll send you.
Okay.
Joseph F. Rychlak. Rychlak. These Western names, man. It's called Personality and Psychotherapy.
Okay.
Introduction to Personality and Psychotherapy.
It's a text of some kind for school.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, and you brought. What did you want to bring up about it?
Yeah. So you remember you were saying everything happens for a reason, or it doesn't, something like that.
Yeah, I wanted to correct that in a way, just because there are still within the naturalistic worldview, everything can happen for a reason as long as that reason is impersonal or unconscious. So it's like laws of nature, where through the law of gravity, then the universe can come into existence. Through the laws of physics, planets can come into existence. Through the laws of evolution, complex organisms can come into existence. Those are the types of reasons that I suppose even through a deterministic worldview can happen, but they're impersonal.
And that is what was so interesting, because when you said, right, even though you want to revise it now, you said everything happens for a reason, and that started thinking, making me think about the cause. And when we in the West hear about the cause, right? So we think like something happened which set off a chain of events and
Hmm.
which caused this, or we
Hmm.
describe it in this sense that you what is the material, like you have a brain which has all these neurons, and in the one place the vessel burst or something, the material something, and you got this, or when you talk about cancer, we describe what it is, like it's a lump of cells,
Hmm.
which are not functioning properly or something like that. But this guy talks about cause at four levels. I thought it was interesting to bring that up. So first cause is material cause. uh, he defines it as the pre-assumed underlying unchanging essence of a thing at any given point in time, right? For example, wood consists of a particular molecular structure, a cloth, flesh, genes, these are all different. Carbon has a different structure. So what the cause at the material level. Another one is efficient cause. I don't know why he came up with the names, but that's what he did.
These are from
So
old Greek philosophy. Uh, yeah, this is old stuff. He's pulling it from
yeah.
Is that
Plato
Aristotle?
and
Oh,
Yeah.
Aristotle. Yeah,
Mhm.
Aristotle's this efficient. Yeah, yeah. I'm assuming there's going to be a teleological in there too, right?
There you go. I don't need to even speak now. So,
No, no, no,
uh,
dude. Yeah, it's a
okay.
good point. Good point.
Yeah, that's why we like Tyler. Uh, so, the succession of events over time, the efficient cause, the succession of events over time that are believed to originate or sustain motion. Push, move, for example, activate, make happen. So one might explain that you went there, you were exposed to radiation, and that caused your cells to develop this, and then this happened, and then this happened, and now you are going to die. So kind of a chain of events, right? Then these last two are so interesting to me, because the first two we are familiar with. This one is called formal cause, the framework or style of organization or internal consistency of an object or an event in experience. For example, personality type, blueprint, shape, outline. So, uh, and the last one is final cause, which is the teleological one that the Tyler was referring to. So, this is the reason.
wait,
And yeah,
sorry, I want to better understand the one prior to that. It's like
yeah,
if
yeah. Go ahead, go ahead.
an object exists within a certain context of the person beholding it. So, like, if he sees a picture of a woman, it would have no context. But if that picture is of the person's mother, then it would have a new like meaning to it. Is that what?
Mm-hmm.
If it's based off of personality or
Let me try to let me try to. Yeah. Okay. So let's say you have a knife. All right. You have a knife and you're holding it in your hand. The the structure of the knife is explained in its form, and that's it. You
Mm-hmm.
can look at it and you can see its shape. There's nothing more to it than that. That's its form. That's the first cause that we were talking about there. Then you have the explanation for how it came to be, the contiguous kind of cause and event that created the knife, the forming of the knife, rather. So the verb of it, right? So the
Mhm.
hammer that hammered it, the metals that the ore that was gathered and smelted, and the wood that was carved for the handle, etc. Right? Then you have this, and this is the formal cause, the one that's I think hardest to try to conceptualize. You have a knife in your hand, and you live in a world where nothing can be cut. What's the purpose of a knife, right? That's the formal, let's say. So the existence
No,
of its
that's the
cause.
final. That's
No,
the
no, no, no,
final. The
no, no,
okay,
no, not
that
quite,
no,
not
okay,
quite. Yeah, not
okay,
quite.
okay.
Right, right.
Hmm.
Because the final, the teleological, is that you or some actor created the thing for the purpose of cutting,
Hmm.
right? And whether or
Very good.
not that something to cut exists, or maybe you're living in a stone quarry and you made a nice knife, but now nothing can be cut, perhaps, right? Your universe is very small. But, or you can always cut yourself, maybe. Maybe you're a stone golem. Who knows? That middle one, the formal, one of the middle ones, the formal is hard as
okay. So like an apple exists within a context where mammals across the globe can eat of this type of thing,
right?
But that doesn't signify, like, through the naturalistic worldview where they've cut out the teleological cause, that apple merely exists and it happens to correlate with, say, the mammals that enjoy eating it.
Right.
Or it's not just happens, it's like evolved through the evolution process that's been able to survive because of its codependence upon, say, the mammals that breed and plant these types of apples.
Well, all right. So this is a really interesting part of the creation story. Let's say in the Old Testament, "Thou shalt not eat of the apple, or the fruit of that tree. Thou shalt not eat." No, it wasn't really an apple, right? But this is akin to saying the formal cause of this apple is an ought that you should not partake of, right? And yet the kind of leap of cause from one category to another, taking the thing that was not a thing to be eaten and making it a thing to be eaten, that's something so interesting and so profound, right? It's very much tied up in what consciousness is. The ability to see things as functional and choosing their form, right? So I don't think you can dispense with the teleological, which is what they try to do, right? In many cases, because you can't have the final form without choice.
Yeah, so I think that's where, like, antinatalism comes in. If there is no teleological reason for life existing within the universe, then there is no objective need or objective betterness that would require life to, or it's not required, but that makes it so there's this should, that life should exist or continue to exist.
No, but you can't say there is no teleological reason for existence of life because this is such a mental construct. I can always come up with a teleological reason for life existing. I might say it was God's plan, so that is called deity telic. So the deity, the God, for some reason, some cause created life in his image. So there you have got the final cause for that. Or somebody might say life exists so that universe can contemplate itself. So you can always come up with a telic reason, it seems, but you can't say your reason is true and mine is not. So I think that's the trouble.
The postmodern argument. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like for myself, I kind of see it as life being, well, Carl Sagan has a quote within the book Cosmos that it's something akin to, perhaps, given the complexity of the universe, life is an inevitable, fact, something like that. So Carl Sagan is a great writer. It seems like there's the poetic naturalism that I think that Sean Carroll, he talks about a bit about, how there's that aspect of the universe being able to look back upon itself and understand it in a small way, but still in a very important way, that makes life good. Like, within the context of the universe, it is good that life is capable of understanding itself, or that the universe, or aspects of the universe are able to understand itself. That's why consciousness is a desired outcome into the future with like AI and things of that sort. There's that. Sorry, yeah.
We made that a goal of ours, right? To recreate us. We want to create us, which is another, bolt in the quiver of proof that there's something fascinatingly strange about consciousness that isn't quite the same as what you would conceptualize random matter doing its thing. And so the way I see it is, you and I are the most, we're the leading edge of reality right now, okay? Like, all of us in existence currently are the leading edge of the most complicated patterns of choices and rule states living in harmony of some kind. There is a reality where nothing has a teleological or a final or any cause. And you can kind of conceptualize that as like the infinite possibility of chaos, or rather the pre-Big Bang soup of energy with no actualization, right? And that there are these very specific rules that were then implemented at a given time that, if followed, if the rules are followed, if the oughts are lived up to, if the religion of physics, if you want to call it that, was lived up to, you could capture the electron plasma around a proton and produce a hydrogen, right? And then further combine into more and more complexity. But at every step, let's call it a particle, but it's not really a particle. There's no such thing as particles. Every system of choices was choosing to follow that particular rule. And with our understanding of quantum mechanics, we now know that things don't always follow the rules. There isn't a guarantee down at the bottom. But for the things that do, you can develop more and more complex, more highly energetic structures. And as those things combine into greater and greater contractions, this is what you end up with at the leading edge. Now, 1 billion years from now, 5 billion years from now, infinity, eternity, what does that become? Who knows? And if it's always happening, always already, to borrow from philosophy, and what does that mean? Right? What does it mean to be a part of it? What does it mean to be this collection of physical things that you're piloting? I mean, you're not aware of all the choices that the subatomic particles are making. You're just aware of the highest, most abstract level of choices. Or maybe you are aware of what those are, but this is the experience of it, right? That's what awareness of it is, the combined conscience experience of all the matter choosing properly to capture and orbit its electrons and all of that. This is the conscious experience, right? Associated with whatever the nervous system is, which is fascinatingly strange.
Are you trying to say, Tyler, that these small particles went through some kind of evolution where if they got organized in a particular if they followed a particular set of rules, or then they are more likely to be turned into more complex things, and those things more complex. So
yeah, well, so like, let's take radiation, for instance. You can say a truth about a half-life of a substance, but you can never determine the actual, say, timing of the release of a beta particle or anything like that, right? You can't say for sure. It seems very much the case that every system of energy, whatever it is, has the potential to choose what it's supposed to do and when it's supposed to do it. Right? And you can only speak broadly about systems that are behaving in such a way if those systems are all behaving that way. Right? It's kind of the anthropological argument, or the anthropomorphic argument. That's how I conceptualize it. That all systems of choice have a choice space, right? That you have what is possible, right? So for a proton and an electron and a single electron, what's possible is the proton in the middle, and the electron can be anywhere in the realm outside of the proton within a certain distance from the proton. It could be anywhere in that region. But with two, you're then confined to these kind of hemispherical shells because the two electrons repel each other in like force. And so for some reason, we don't really know why, they can't pass over this kind of barrier, and it gives you a polarity or a geometrical orientation to the system, right? But as long as those electrons and protons are obeying what they're supposed to be doing, they can stay a hydrogen atom or a helium and keep adding and growing and growing and growing. At any given moment, the more complex the system, it can all break down, right? But the more complex the system, it seems, the less likely it is to break down, because you have this harmonious reconfiguration of energy continuously, right? It's all organized as a type of transfer and exchange.
Well, you're bringing up language that seems almost improper with the context that you're using. So there's kind of this understanding that the things within the smallest, or the things outside of consciousness merely are obeying the laws of nature, such as the law of gravity. That's not the rock choosing to fall down. It's the rock falling down outside of its own power. And I don't know, the gravity affecting it.
Yeah, but I don't think that's the case, right? Because that's what I'm saying. Like, if you look at the quantum world, and essentially us looking at the quantum world is us removing the outside influence within a particular system of energy, right? So the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is talking about what happens when you look at something and ask what it's doing, right? But in quantum mechanics, and this has been demonstrated to such extraordinary fidelity, now it's just no longer questioned by anyone in physics, I think. There seems to be no hard and fast rule state that all particles or systems of energy obey. Okay, it's non-deterministic.
Okay.
Rather, it's
Yeah.
non-deterministic.
Yeah,
so the way I'm conceptualizing that is choice.
Mm. Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So because it's not behaving under a predictable pattern in the same way that, say, like laws of motion occurs, you can't say whether or not it is deterministically ran,
but
because that's outside of your knowledge.
You see how bound up that is? You say, like, because you are... The way that science has pictured the world now, it's hard to even imagine what it means for matter to be obeying laws without choice. Right? Like, so you throw a baseball and it flies in a parabolic arc, right? In the influence of the gravitational well here. And you say that because you've seen the baseball do this a million times. That's what science is. It's the inductive approach. I've seen it happen a million times. I'm pretty sure it's following a rule. The rule is follow this straight line in the gravitational well, right? But what we've now discovered is we've narrowed down and we've looked, and things aren't behaving that way. Not really. They're not really behaving that way. We are just organizing our observations into convenient rules, right? Convenient attempts to understand. Now, set aside the fact that we're doing that at all to begin with, right? How could you ever do that if you didn't think that rules were a thing to begin with, right? So I don't see any difference between the baseball having a choice and all of its subatomic particles choosing together based on their experience, let's say, of what it is to be whatever it is they are, and human beings piloting their body throughout. There's definitely connection there. If you look at something like the motion of people in a room, right? If you look at the way that they organize themselves and the way they bounce around, or if you try to predict the stock market, you can use the same kinds of equations that you do for Brownian motion, right? Which seem to be random interactions between particles bouncing into each other. Set aside the fact that the equations we use are just approximations, right? They're never even close to what's really going on. We don't even have a solution for the three-body problem. We cannot use any math, zero math, there's no math whatsoever for three bodies coming together and interacting at the same time. We don't have a way to do that. We have to approximate. So like there's, and that's an interesting little point about what it is to have free will and choice, but what it is to bring a third party in, let's say, right? A non-binary option. But yeah, that's how I conceive of it. That free will, as we experience it, is also experienced by every single thing, all things, all stuff. And that its structure and form and your experience of it, the conscious experience that you have, everything, is simply the highest manifestation of whatever system of energy and its cooperative attempts has produced.
Okay. At least I'm seeing now like where differences are coming from, because it's kind of that all or nothing approach where like you have the position that all things behave according to their own will insofar as they have that capacity, and I guess from very base level they always have that capacity within the quantum realm, or the quantum level of looking at things. Mm-hmm. And from the naturalistic worldview, all things are deterministic, even if you're unable to or even if you're unable to say whether or not with any authority whether or not the things are deterministic or not. Because like there's the what is it? If you had all amounts of knowledge within the world, you could be able to predict everything that would occur into the future. If you essentially had the mind of God.
That's what I mean. We know that's not possible now. We know that. Like, we know that as firmly as we know anything in science now. We know it's not possible. We know it is not possible to determine what happens in the future. Like, we can say that. It's been proven essentially as far as anything in our entire history of knowledge has been proven. That has been proven. Mm-hmm. Absent any interaction with another system with its own intents and energies and whatever, a given quantum system, in some sense, will not make a choice. It won't choose. And if it does choose, we don't know what it does, like why it chooses. The two-slit experiment is a very good demonstration of what it is to have a single system of energy not make a choice, and yet also make a choice. It's fascinatingly weird, but it seems to be the same type of experience that we have as a conscious being. That we see the choice space before us, right? And in some sense, much of what we do as a conscious being is not actually the development of choice, but actually the constriction of it. A great deal it has to do with the pruning of choices, right? And in fact, having too many choices is a terribly bad thing. But it's very similar at those two levels. The quantum mechanical level of rule states that exist and that the particles have the chance to obey or disobey a particular rule at any given time, and human beings, right? And I think, yeah, that's what consciousness and the conscious experience is your perception of the highest level abstraction of all of those choices being made in combined, coordinated effort to achieve some rule state, which we say is a goal or whatever. That seems to be the clearest way for me to conceptualize what consciousness is and what this system of oughts is. So to bring it back to what the reason I originally brought that up is the antinatalists are right. Okay, they're in some sense they're right. So you could have a non-Big Bang, let's say, right? You could have just plasma and protons and nobody obeying any rules and no suffering and everything is the same. That is an option, okay? It's an option. And in fact, plenty of things are that way now, right? We don't even know what dark matter is or dark energy. Maybe that's a representation of the things that aren't choosing to be combined into systems of coherent energy. Maybe. Who knows, right? But the things that do eventually build up into more and more complex systems of cooperative energy, which is us. Right? The leading edge of the most complex cooperative system of energy ever that we know of. Right? And if it continues on into eternity, why can't you have a God? I don't know the answer to that, but it seems pretty straightforward to at least ask it.
Mm-hmm. Peterson recently was asked about this question of free will, and he brought up an interesting perspective that the further back from you are from the present. So like, say in this present moment, I can make choices for how I would like the future to go. And as I get closer and closer towards that future, things become more deterministic in their fulfillment of that choice. Essentially, it's like you can't change the past at all, and it's like that's how determinism fails. It is that you can't predict the future, and thus the future becomes deterministic through the present, essentially. And even during the present, you're responding based off of kind of unconscious reactions to things. Like your own body is acting outside of your conscious will, but you're reacting in a way that you, through your, in tennis, a person is reacting to the ball before it even reaches his conscious mind.
Right. Yeah,
so
I think maybe Peterson's discussion about how that's...
and the reason that's been able to occur is because in the past, that person has put in the training, has chosen to put in the training so that that unconscious reaction can occur into the future.
Yes. I totally agree. Yeah, because that argument is used by people who... There's a famous experiment where they did some finger wagging and they tried to determine whether or not that was consciously directed and things. Some of the researchers came to the conclusion that conscious and direct control, the feeling of it was occurring after the movement of the finger, and that's my exact counter development to that conclusion, that the conscious direction of the finger was done prior to the initiation of the signal that caused the finger to move. It was you deciding ahead of time that when you saw the light, yes, that's what you were going to do, right? You implanted that pattern of behavior into your mind, or the researcher did when it occurred. It's not a disavowal of free will. It's just an example of it existing already, of it being programmed in.
What seems to be strange, though, about the deterministic nature of the past is that also breaks down when looking at it from a quantum level, because like they're able to produce quantum blockchaining where like these things exist in their superpositional state until like in the present or where you are currently, you change things, and then that change is affected back into the past as well, so that like it kind of changes everything within that. I
don't think time exists. I don't think the past exists. It's a useful way for us to conceptualize.
Well, yeah, it seems to be how electrons behave. Is they're not behaving in a linear fashion at all. They're in all they're within all possibilities at the same moment. There's no lesser of one possibility or higher of another. All there really is just the cloud of any possibility for where this electron can be at when you're looking at it. Maybe, yeah, that's.
But it's not just electrons, by the way. I think they've succeeded with the two-slit experiment up to molecules of like 800 size. 800 molecules. I have to look that up, but it has more to do, it seems, with, again, whether or not you're looking at it. That's what it is, because looking at something is extraordinarily powerful. It's shining photons on something and affecting it, right? You're dumping energy into the system, and photons and the type of energy that you dump into it. The more energy you dump in, the more likely it is that you and your intent are going to change the system. But if you look at the system, or don't look at the system rather, and let it behave on its own, it does its own thing. It does its own thing. And
I think we've kind of fallen off our topic, really. I mean,
do we have a topic?
Yeah, I know we have come off the topic, but I want to be coming off topic because Tyler said something that might have some like even therapeutic significance when he said that there is no past. So can you elaborate on that? Because, like if I went through hell, bunch of people raped me, and, like if there was no past, like could that help me? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. So this is the way. All right, so you can have time is like kind of like cause. You have multiple definitions of it, right? You have the time of entropy, right? So things
entropy increasing, yeah.
Yeah, and in physics, that's really probably the only time that matters. No pun intended. And in psychology, what time is, you have two different kinds, I think. You have the feeling, the felt expression of what it means for time to be passing. So it's like the sense of moving through. It's like space. It's like a spatial sense almost, that you're moving through time. And then there is the recall of memories. So your rape example. That recall of memories is not the past. It's the present. You're running the program, recall this neural structure that produces these images and this feelings at this time now. There's no such thing as past. And if I were to go into your brain and remove all of those neural structures related to the memory of being raped, that's not your past. There is no past there, right? And so that's the value of forgiveness, by the way. The Christian concept of forgiveness is you're changing the past. You're removing it, so to speak. It's the reformulation into something harmonious and whole rather than detrimental. And it's a really important point, because those who cling to the past have a really hard time forgiving. They think of it as like this visual structure of something that occurred, and it's kind of there still, right? And it is. You are recalling it. You're making it still there. As long as you recall it, the more that you recall it, in fact, the more lively those neural structures become, the more they start to pull the blood from the veins and activate the neurotransmitters, because you are reliving the experience, right? There's no such thing as past in that case. What past in terms of the actual rape that did occur is in fact this hugely disparate system of molecules and whatever spread apart now. You know, each person going their own way. Perhaps one of them died and then decomposed and spread out into the ecosystem. But every one of those things doesn't exist as the past. They're now the present, but in a different form. So that there is no such thing as time, really, in that sense.
Just one question. The first meaning of time you described in psychological sense, right? My psychological sense that I'm moving through time, but that might be incultured. Like I have a watch on my wrist, and I'm constantly looking at it. So if I don't carry the watch with me, I get really stressed out, because then I don't know what the time is anymore. So if you were some kind of caveman, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would you still have had a concept of time, like because of the sun, because of the...
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think there's some insight to be gained. There's an Aboriginal tribe, I think it's in Australia. Their conception of time when they think about something is so that the past is actually in front of them rather than behind them, because they can see it. That's how they conceptualize it. The past is the only thing that you can actually see. You recall it, and so it's the thing in front of you. And so when they're talking about the future, they actually refer to something over their shoulder, because it's behind them and they can't see it. They can't see the future. They don't know what's coming. So there's some. You're right. There's got to be some kind of cultural element to the way that we conceptualize it, but it's still a motion of some kind, right? It's still some kind of movement, because the way that, I mean, if you get rid of all the abstract stuff that we're talking about, you could say you're running from a tiger, right? It's movement through space, and your memory of it is the memory of movement through space, and so that's why it's related to time. So when I think of it personally now, I've kind of consciously reordered the way that I visualize time. I no longer try to imagine it left or right, like we would the timeline on a YouTube video. I actually try to imagine it back to front, like I'm sitting on the surface of a giant rock hurtling through space. That's what I'm doing, right? Like I'm on the leading edge of that rock. I'm in this piloting chair, and I'm just like flying through space on a rock, and past is what's behind me. All the structure that was created by the energy and forces of all the things cooperating in their systems of choice, right? And what they've built. That's kind of how I perceive it now. I'll be right back.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
It seems like we need 3 people to have an interesting discussion. That's what I realized.
Well, I would always just to bring out the more scientific aspects that I'm familiar with, but still bring in a lot of interesting perspectives. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So can we ask him to give us some kind of credible links for the viewers on that quantum mechanics thing, because like he seems to be like very much so like it is very strong. He strongly claims that, so I would like to read about that. I don't even know what to Google for.
Mm-hmm. Well, to me, I've done like a little bit of like reading on quantum mechanics. I believe like Richard Feynman, he's done some lectures on it, and he seems to be like the mediator between the layman and trying to understand quantum mechanics. And Feynman brings up this thing that called the sum of all histories, which is only like secondhand since it's brought up in a book that I recently read, A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking. And it seems like, from my at least perspective, if you were to imagine the Earth going around the sun, and then you kind of like sped it up so that, or no, you didn't even speed it up. You recorded that, and then you overlaid every frame of those collections of images over each other, so that there's no longer like the image of the Earth going around and round and around. It's the Earth exists overlapping itself all around the sun in this one position. And if you were to take like a step further back, maybe the sun itself is kind of rotating, and so there's no longer any like marine pattern to the Earth. Maybe it's the Earth and the sun is spinning, and thus the Earth is aligning itself to that spin, and so it kind of ends up to be this kind of cloud around the sun. That's how I imagine like the orbital system without time, or without our conception of time. And it seems to me that if you look at an electron or an atom and the electrons that's surrounding it, that same type of thing is happening, where you can't exactly find the position of an electron orbiting around the proton, or whatever the nucleus, I guess, of it is.
Hey John, are you using a different mic today?
It might be using my headphone mic. Sorry.
Because I don't know if Tyler has noticed it. Let me ask him, because I can hear Tyler just fine.
Okay. Let me see
Hey
if I
Tyler.
can.
Hey.
So can you see? Can you hear John properly, or do you notice like?
It may be that my internet is off.
Oh yeah,
low.
he's breaking up a little bit. Yeah, but your visual quality's always been pretty bad. I just assumed you had a poor connection.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Are you on the boondocks somewhere?
No, it's just middle of nowhere, Missouri.
Yeah.
So anyway,
is it DSL? Sorry.
I don't know. I was just, I think Richard Feynman is probably your best bet at getting an introduction to quantum mechanics, and I think there's some like lectures of his that are online.
Yeah, there are. Tyler, we were talking about like you were making some, with all due respect, very strong claims about quantum mechanics and what have been proven. And John was talking about how like if you want to start, you should start with Richard Feynman to get an introduction. But then he died kind of long time back. So this latest research you were talking about, right?
Well, the two-slig spinner is pretty old.
Oh, that is pretty old.
Yeah, it's getting pretty old. It's what's really, I think, the edge of quantum mechanical research, let's say, right now, is what John mentioned earlier, the quantum entanglement process, and trying to understand what non-locality is, and really the big problems in physics right now are the unification of the general theory of relativity and quantum mechanical understanding of things. So the QED, quantum electrodynamics from Feynman and all. yeah, there's. But again, so I'm not really making any claims. I'm just making observations. I think I'm not claiming that this is the way things are, and that that's how you can explain consciousness, and that all small systems of energy have choice in the same way that we do, or experience it that way. I just think of all the observations that I'm making, that seems to make the most sense.
No. That's not what I was asking.
Oh, yeah.
You were talking about like in general how your process works. I was talking about like specifically that. Sorry. I should have. I just assume everyone is thinking what is in my head. That is obviously
Yeah, I
not
do the same
the.
thing. Yeah.
Yes. So you were saying specifically that things have a choice. The proton has a choice. Electron has a choice. So
Mm-hmm.
where is the seminal paper or article on that we can put in the video description?
Well,
Right.
yeah, okay. Let's say, all right, so the classical division in understanding in this argument of quantum mechanics is about whether or not things are choosing. I say would be the difference between, it's like the Copenhagen version of quantum mechanics and its description, and something like pilot wave theory, maybe. As far as who to go, what single link? Feynman's good, but he's kind of all over the place. I don't know of a single. Probably somebody more like Brian Singer. Yeah. Let me look real quick. Let me see. You mean just in terms of a general understanding of the two-slit experiment and all that?
I didn't get what whole the two slit was about. I'm not. I should stop calling myself an engineer then. I was talking specifically about like I don't even know what two slit experiment was all about anymore. So.
Man. Then you've got a great experience in front of you, learning about the two-slit experience. That is let me tell you, that is the thing that blew my mind as a teenager.
Okay.
And it's been blown ever since.
Okay, so anything that can get people started on that particles having their own choice thing, because that was you said pretty strongly that it's historically like no one is disputing it anymore. So.
Oh yeah, no one disputes the results of the two-slit experiment. The interpretation is, of course, always up to dispute, right? Interpretation is always up to dispute.
Okay, so sorry to stop you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
So that thing came out of two-slit experiment, that whole choice hypothesis about things.
Well, that's my understanding of it, and probably others as well. But that's my best attempt at understanding what is occurring there. Is that choice exists at the quantum level, right?
That's your understanding or understanding of you and a lot of other scientific folks?
I would imagine there are a great number of scientific folks who share that. Yes, and
it seems like Roger Penrose, and there's this YouTube video I watched recently, the like quantum consciousness and the microtubules. It's by Stuart Hameroff.
Hameroff,
yeah.
Hameroff,
I guess he works with Roger Penrose, yeah, and it seems to make quite a bit of sense for the evolution of life as well as like consciousness, or at least it's putting forward a hypothesis that tends to make quite a bit of sense. But I don't know. I'm not involved in the field, so it's really I can only speculate as to how much information I've taken in, and that there's not a lot of like work or at least there's not a lot of fleshful work on consciousness, and so this is something that seems to at least fit in some regard to things. because like, oh, am I? Oh no, sorry. There's the idea that the brain is kind of just a computational machine that is able to kind of work forward with all the amounts of information put into it. But there's tests that Penrose brings up in the what is it, the Emperor's New Mind, how a computer is unable to kind of like predict an unpatterned like if you have a series of shapes and you try to fit them together, and they weren't a repeating pattern, a computer would not be able to speculate whether or not that could be done infinitely across a plane. That's something that is only able to be done so far by, I don't know, our human community or our human capacity.
Right.
So maybe
it's really interesting about this because essentially what let's say the strong AI people, the claim that they're making is that consciousness is computational, it's algorithmic. So in other words, it's a set of rules that are followed exactly the same way every time. That's what an algorithm is. That's what computation is. You follow the rules exactly the same every single time. The problem with that is that there are truths that exist outside of the rule structure that you've chosen. And this was proven back in the 30s by Kurt Gödel, right? And if you want to put a description in there, that's certainly the place. You know what? Gödel, Escher, Bach is a great book to read. Maybe we should go. Oh, let's go over that. Okay, I'm saving that thought for another time. But yeah, so let's say you have a set of rules. Math is a great example of it. This is what Gödel did. Logic, essentially, is a set of rules. And you can produce statements about what is true with using those rules, right? So the rule 2 + 2 = 4, that's a statement of truth. That's just a value that you've created. 2 + 2 = 4. You follow the rules. That's the result. Boom. You've got a statement of truth, a string, right, in logical proposition. What Kurt found out was that no matter what system of rules you choose, if the system is sufficiently complex to do anything as simple as just arithmetic, essentially, it can produce and or has truths about the system that cannot be derived from within the system. It is impossible to figure out all of the ways in which you can combine numbers together without stepping outside of it somehow. And it's a very unintuitive and difficult to understand concept. But if you take it on faith at the moment, it just is the case. You can always produce, or you can always find some truth about the system that cannot be produced using only the rules of the system. So what it seems that consciousness is the ability to, and this is that meta process, the meta creation of a new rule set above and beyond what you're currently looking at. Right? That's what consciousness is. It's the ability to imagine outside of your rule space and then find a truth that exists outside of your rule space and then reformulate a new rule space, adding that rule to it. Yeah.
Kind of like creating a new value structure out of the current value structure. Like if we are purely made to follow our genes biological process of attempting to, that's probably outside it. But
yeah, no, it's exactly right. It's just such an insanely complex abstract system that it's difficult for us to draw a direct correlation between something like the logical propositions of Kurt Gödel and the religious propositions of all of Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism or something like that. But I believe they're bound by the same rules, or rather not, in some strange way. right? Not felt.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's
Yeah.
what's so weird about it. That,
I see it kind of related to Alan Turing's halting problem, where
yeah,
if a computer is told to produce basically a response that kind of would equate to a paradox, then the computer is unable to kind of continue on from there, or it basically it creates a paradox where the computer cannot move forward from that.
or just keeps going forever, right?
Yeah.
That's the rigidity of the rule structure. That's the algorithmic
Yeah,
nature of
it
computation.
step outside itself to fix itself.
Right. Yep. And that's why Penrose and Hameroff think, because he used the Turing, the halting problem pretty extensively, and I think in the Inverse New Mind it's been, yeah, it's in there for sure. Right? But it's consciousness is that which can step outside of the way things are and imagine the way things aren't, right? And that value, that the value of that is that you can reorganize things in a new and more efficient and more truthful manner, let's say. You can find some new truth and add it. It's
fascinating. So that's the problem with, like, that's Sam Harris's fear about AI, is that it will be given a value and it will fulfill that value to, like, the greatest capacity, and then later we find out, shoot, that value is not a very good thing to give it to it, because, like, if we tell it, okay, you need to paper clips, and then it starts to turn people into paper clips, then that's bad value that we don't want to fail at. Mm-hmm. If people have the capacity to take on new value structures, and if that could be a good indication of there being something more than a meat machine. That if
I don't have a problem with meat machine. Okay, so here's it. The left hemisphere follows the rules. The right hemisphere does not. All right, so I'll give you an example of how I consider it. So in the New Testament, Christ is sitting there, and some people bring a woman caught in adultery to him, and they say, Christ, the rules state this woman must be stoned. She was caught in adultery. Those are the rules. We must follow them. And Christ, scratching in the dirt, says, he who's without sin, let him throw the first stone. And then everybody leaves. It says the oldest first, by the way. This is an interesting commentary about youth and wisdom. But then he asks her, woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? And she says, no. And he says, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. This is a perfect example of what it is to be a conscious creature, non-algorithmic, I think. You have a set of rules that must be followed. And yet somehow in the mediation between the left and right hemisphere, in the feminine, compassionate side, you say, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? There is another rule, a greater rule, a higher rule, the rule of forgiveness, the rule of treat your neighbor as yourself. And that meta-appropriation of this new rule suddenly reorganizes the systems of energy in your hemispheres and all of their abstract complications, right? So that's what it is to be a conscious creature. Sumit, leaving us?
Yeah, I guess so.
Sorry about that. I need to be at office. It's 11:35, so I should start preparing for sleep.
Never apologize.
Okay.
But it was. Thank you for bringing up that story. It's my favorite story.
Oh, the New Testament Christ. Yeah, I often.
The prostitute one, because many times I felt like one myself, like done, made mistakes, and if he can forgive the prostitute, like that's a very, that's like a remarkable thing he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
True.
even in the Old Testament, there's a parallel with the story of Isaiah, who's a prophet that is told to marry a prostitute, and then that prostitute leaves him, and he keeps on returning to her as a image of God and our adulterous selves that we are.
Yeah.
All right, sorry guys, gotta go.
Okay.
Lovely evening.
Yeah.
I think.
And Tyler, we appreciate your inputs, like Ben, you bring in like stuff that we don't, we don't. It's very much a learning for us.
Yeah, we all need the different perspectives, right? I totally agree. All our own voices are meaningful.
Yeah. So that capacity to step outside the value structure that was put into you, that it just reminds me of a thing, since we're reading Demons by Dostoevsky. Early on, there's a conversation about suicide, how suicide is kind of that exact thing of, like, and in the same way, it's kind of the antinatalist position where, despite being created for this specific purpose, we have the capacity to reject that purpose and to basically go against it in a way that, say, like a robot would be, or an artificial intelligence would be incapable of doing.
Right. Well, so our artificial intelligence and our robots are just extensions of ourselves. They're tools that we've programmed. We've programmed to, well, so we've used a value system, our conscious value system, to determine what the rules should be, because they're related to the carrying out of the goals that we want the robot or the algorithm to achieve. So it's like, it's no different than the programming of any particular neural circuitry in our brain, right? So when you learn to do math in your head, you, the conscious thing, are programming your brain to follow those rules. And insofar as it behaves like a computer, you don't break the rules, right? 2 + 2 = 4 every time. But if you're willing to break the rules, you can discover clock arithmetic, let's say, right? You can discover that sometimes 2 + 2, when you're using mod 1, doesn't equal 4, because 4 doesn't exist in that system. The addition of two things together ends up, being something else. So it's essentially the idea that you can add to and take away from the rule sets, the rule structures. Which is akin to the creation of new electron energy shells, or new molecular configurations, new geometric configurations, because you have binding energies and outside forces, external forces, that all contribute to the geometrical shape and activity of a particular physical structure, like a molecule. But then the process of making something new is like adding a new rule set to it, right? So the single electron, the rule is you can go anywhere on the outside of the proton. 2 electrons, and you can no longer go anywhere, or you should not go anywhere, right? You should be confined to one hemispherical split. You add a 3rd electron, you get this other weird handle that pumps off, or you start developing these more and more complex shells of energy. But yeah, like how that actually happens, the transition that occurs when those things happen, we have no clue. That's akin to the three-body problem, right? So it's the word quantum leap, right? That's where we come from. How does an electron change shells? How does it alter its configuration? What's occurring in that time? Yeah, I think along these lines, I don't know of any better conceptualization of consciousness as yet, and how it relates to the quantum level, but it doesn't really give us any insight on how to behave, right? We've already got that. We've already got. It seems like, so the creation of the United States, for instance, if you follow certain rules, you can make something nice, right? In your own life, if you follow the rules in a given system, you can make something nice. You can experience productivity and success. It seems like much of what we argue over was common sense not so long ago in terms of our social mores and things, but yeah.
So this brings up I kind of went into this conversation with that mindset of nihilism and like how to step out of that in the through the anti-natalist perspective. And this brings up an interesting point of, because we have that capacity to step out of our own selves or even our own rules. Okay, so
that's Nietzsche, by the way. That's Nietzsche. That's the same exact thing. Yeah.
Well, having just read through Demons, there was the discussion about suicide, and on the back cover of my copy, it has a quote from that discussion between these two characters. Whoever conquers pain and fear, he himself will be God. And it's talking about how the person that is able to no longer fear death, they are not bound by the human condition, exactly, which is Nietzsche. I mean, that's basically what Dostoevsky is constantly going into Nietzsche. And it's funny because Nietzsche has several quotes about where he himself was saying, perhaps now that God has left the scene, I myself have become God, or something to that effect. That it is the difference, perhaps, between Judaism and Christianity. Whereas there's the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve were both unconscious and were enticed into becoming conscious and regretted it, and were cursed to live within that new state of mind that they can no longer come out of. Just like how somebody being born into this world, they have no choice in the matter, and they are forced to be in this world and suffer the consequences of existing and being aware of existing. And then you have the new Adam and the new Eve with Mary and Jesus.
But what if we did choose? What if we did choose to come here? Right?
It's hard to say exactly if it would even be us, because we have no memory of choosing, and no body to, no prior body to have that. Even if you have experiences and then you forget about it, you'll have the muscle or the physical representations of experience having occurred.
Or maybe
when you have no body, when you have no body and you have no ability to remember. It's hard to exactly say that both you and that previous person that did make the choice could be equivalent. Now, but I think the story of, or the new Adam and the new Eve with Mary and Jesus kind of reversed from the previous story, because it's Mary choosing and then Jesus choosing to accept suffering in the same way that kind of Socrates does. There's that embodiment of the good, as in the case of Socrates, and the embodiment of God in the case of Jesus, where despite having no knowledgeable choice in the matter, we can become God in the sense of becoming one with God by not throwing away, but by rejecting our meat machine and having faith in something greater than ourselves. And maybe because of our capacity to reject our meat machine, then that's a piece of evidence towards the possibility of something greater than ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so rejecting the meat machine is akin to rejecting the rule states. That's right. It's the same thing. You're saying the meat is producing a particular set of rules that I should follow, but no, I'm not going to. Right. That's it. We conceptualize the biological aspects as the set of rules that were granted to us by all of the previous iterations of us that existed throughout evolutionary history. Right? Yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know. I can't step away from the. Like for myself personally, I see how naturalism fits with evolution, because naturalism, or at least the scientific method, is the removal of value from things and only how they kind of like act upon each other, and there's no value structure. However, for at least from my own perspective, in order for life to continue, there's a requirement of value within the material. Like there's higher value of food, and sure, that is subjective to the species. So like there's a higher value for socializing within mammals, then there's a higher value for socializing within, say, reptiles. It is a subjective thing, but I think it still tends towards some sort of evidence of value when a subject fulfills that value or utilizes that value, that's a better word, then that subject now becomes something greater. That creature evolves into something different from what it was previously.
Yeah.
It's I guess a pragmatic approach that contradicts, at least within my perspective, the naturalistic worldview of things.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a conscious thing. Like it's not like value has to have come from consciousness. It could be, in the case of like Plato, there's some sort of source of goodness by which how we act correlates with that and then rewards us. Even like Socrates says, the quote, I need to actually memorize this because it's something I keep on thinking about, because it's something that is so conflicting with my own personhood. That a good man, no evil can ever befall a man. I can't even say I believe it yet, but it's something that is nagging at me continually. That somebody that is embodying the good, no matter what they do, no matter what is done to them, it cannot overcome the good that they embody.
Yeah, and those are our most heroic stories too. The underdog, right? The supreme opposition to that which must be inevitable.
And it's because of those figures that our culture changes. Despite, like them dying in the matter, as in the case of Socrates or Jesus or Joan of Arc or
martyrdom.
That or Copernicus. These are changes to our psyche that it's just like in the case of Adam, where as soon as you eat the apple, as soon as you kill Jesus, then you're put into a new position. That's that new. It's in the same. It's the exact same thing as Adam. So, like, if Adam is the Jews, or it's like as soon as Jesus dies, we realize our mistake in the case of Adam, and we must now suffer the consequences.
Right. So, all right. So Handel's Messiah. Have you listened to the Messiah?
No, I don't know what that is.
It's a very famous series of pieces of music that,
I think I've heard like a few notes from it, or probably, like it's a reminder. Like I remember hearing it recently. There was some violinist that was playing a piece from it, and it was something familiar to me. So
he made this as it exists in our popular culture randomly from time to time. Mm-hmm. He made this and many musicians, let's say, from that period of time, made their music in the presence of God, let's say, in the attempt to worship and create for a God. You can take any other martyr if you want that you're talking about and do the same thing with this, but if he's trying to make this musical composition regarding Christ and God and such, what is the energy behind that creation, right? What is it that actually caused him to do all of that? What was the force behind it? And if I go to my neighbor who wronged me last week, maybe he killed my dog on accident or something, and I say to the neighbor, I'm going to forgive you because that's what Christ would want me to do. And Christ was the real deal, say. What is that exchange, right? It's the belief that one individual has that the thing that Christ did and the things that he said matter. And so in some sense, like, I know a lot of people conceptualize these things as kind of a mystical sense in religion, but the notion of forgiveness, or in this case, in the death of Christ and the atonement, seems very straightforward to me in this description, that what Christ did, his martyrdom, was so profound a rejection of the rule state that it had rippling ramifications for the next 2 millennia, right? That's what a martyrdom is. That's what the sealing of the testimony with blood is. That it's this rejection of the rule state that's so profound and so inspiring and capable of being packaged in a meme that it propagates and produces as a direct result of that propagation good, profound good, profound structure. I mean, look at the total number of cathedrals raised around the world versus, say, like, if I were to make a YouTube video and say, listen, guys, amazing atheist here. Oh, that's an actual guy, isn't it? Sorry, amazing atheist. I don't know anything about you, but I've heard your name. And here's my message to you. The universe is a bunch of random bullshit and whatever, right? Like, just do your thing. What did that inspire? What has that ever inspired? It's not even remotely on the same level, right? There's something there that Christ did that has since produced uncountable good, right? And within the good, there's also the little dot of blackness, right? There's the yin and the yang. So as a reaction to that, other rule states have competed for the resources, let's say. But that's how I conceptualize martyrdom and how I conceptualize the potency or the impact of this rejection of rule states. And that's how I see the atonement. The notion that we can forgive each other and not stone each other to death for making mistakes all the time. It's that, right? And it requires a refreshing from time to time with the blood of sacrifice, which is so strange because it makes sense on that teleological level, and yet it is also our earliest conception of what it is to sacrifice, right? Like in the Old Testament, to refresh with the blood of some other creature or with ourselves, or our productivity, right? Because it was always the best of what you had and the first of what you made. Yeah, we don't have that now in science. You don't have anything like that. You don't have anything powerful in science. There's nothing powerful in science other than the technological structures that you can create. But it's the value system that directed the creation, and the value system didn't come from science. We need to stop this weird dichotomy between science and religion. Like it's a battle between the two. It's just absurd.
It's two alternative worldviews that each have their own profits and losses within.
Mm-hmm. And language. Yeah.
I sometimes wonder if it really, like, the scientific method requires kind of a value-free look at things. And I wonder if maybe atheism is the best mindset for a human to have in order to be a good scientist, because they're looking at things from that perspective already.
Okay, I would disagree. I would disagree, and this is why. Because I think that the value structure of let's say Christianity, but for all of our fathers of science, Newton, Bacon, they were deeply interested in proving God and meeting him, so to speak,
Was Bacon? I thought Bacon was like the start of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, well, both
Like-
were. Both were the start of the Enlightenment, but within them were certainly the search for God, right? As Spinoza, some other philosophers.
Yeah. Spinoza, he had the impartial God. That.
Right. Yeah, and so our conceptualization of what God is and what it may be certainly changes over time. But in the presence of that, so imagine if you're just, you're a good little scientist, and you truly and fully believe there is a God, and that your greatest good to that God, your greatest worship of that God, is to find out the truths of how he built this world, right? That's how some of them conceived it.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of effort... Yeah, the amount of effort...
There's the astronomer Hugh Ross. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like they're consumed with the passion of that belief and use it as a resource, so a wellspring of eternal hope, right, to discover the truth.
Okay, well, here's maybe a better... maybe it's not just atheism. It could be that, like...
skepticism.
There's Jewish scientists that are quite... like, yeah, Spinoza and Einstein and others, that they have that conception of God, that they know how he's not an all-loving God, or at least his love does not limit him in how he acts against us.
Right.
Maybe it's the Christian perspective has tainted how we approach the universe.
I think it's a combination of factors, but it's a big part of it is like a rejection of the kind of pastoral understanding of what God may be, or some provincial idea of what a God is, right? So Spinoza would say that he discovered God by these, geometrical, logical proposition, these lemmas, or just his development of this impartial being is his conception of what God is, as a rejection of something as simplistic as, say, the image of a man smiling down on you, light radiating, saying, do this, don't do that, right? Now, in the same way that I can look at a human being and see their outline and see their surface and miss all of the underlying complexity, I mean, to an absurd degree, right? I don't see all their organs. I certainly don't see the microscopic level of detail that is so far beyond our conception of what complex is that we still can't make heads or tails much of it, right? And in the same way that there is truth in the complexity of the structure of my body at that resolution, it's also true that I have this kind of cartoonish caricature of what I am just by looking at the outside. So I think this Spinoza and the provincial view of God both exist as truths based on whatever internal conceptualization you can make, whatever resolution you can make of what you're looking at.
I mean, that's brought up in towards the end of Brave New World with the savage and the ruler of that city, that God appears differently to each man.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you see with the eyes that you have. Or, in fact, and this is what's so weird about consciousness, you see with the eyes you don't yet have, and you build new eyes. That's so weird, right? It's just very odd. What you don't have now, you can build it. If your eyes are bad, you can make glasses, or a telescope, or a spectrometer. But the refinement of vision and measurement does not in any way, shape, or form invalidate the philosophical, logical propositions that lead one to believe that there is a good and a God and all those things. I see it very much as kind of extra scientific approach for skeptics to reject the rule states that they were forced to swallow as children. Right? This is what happens to people. They get raised in a particular set of Christian beliefs or Hindu beliefs or whatever, and they get to a point where they're exposed to some other set of rules, however that's packaged, be it another religion or science, which is another religion. And then there's a set of beliefs and rules associated with that, right? And you can adopt bits and pieces from anywhere you want, as long as you can harmonize them in your head somehow. A lot of people don't do good harmonizing, though.
There's this really interesting essay by Paul Graham called "What You Can't Say," and he theorizes that the taboo of words is the foundation for the next generation, essentially. So things like there's kind of this fashion sense where that for customs. And so if there's something that can't be said about, then the children that have been brought up in that environment, it's like it's not just within their nature, it's within their, I guess, their rebellious nature to then take that on as their fundamental truth, or it's not their truth.
Thou shalt not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Oh, okay, Dad. Sure thing. Sure thing, Dad.
Yeah.
It wasn't my fault. The serpent made me do it. Yeah. Yeah.
But like with Hegel, it seems like it's kind of a repeating pattern where it's just one extreme to the next extreme, to the other extreme. But it can't help but seeing some sort of progress still occurring. Like each side is building the other one up and then destroying. It's like each one builds themselves up and then destroys the other person's tower, and then the other tower gets built up and then destroys the other one.
Yeah.
To a point that they have to surpass each other.
Right. It's like the refinement process is violent.
Yeah. Okay. Quite the conversation, definitely.
It is, man. It's the.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The dialogue between two things, but I don't see where to go from here exactly in this conversation. And as it's been 3 hours or so, yeah.
Yeah, you end it here. I think that's okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was good. Okay, so yeah, anyone that is still listening, it says we have a viewer here. So, hello
viewer,
whoever that is. It's probably somebody else from within our group, I suspect. We shall be, discussing the Matt Dillahunty, Jordan Peterson debate this weekend. So, this upcoming weekend. So, if you would like to take part in that conversation, then feel free to join us at jordanbpeterson.community. That has all the links for all the different aspects. So, yeah, thank you all for listening. Thank you for the conversation, Tyler.